I do have, let's start with Melanie Redman. Good afternoon, Miss, and thank you for your participation. Allow me to go to your bio. I apologize ahead of time for any technical problem. I'll do my best to make sure this goes smoothly. Hello, everyone. Thanks for stepping in. So Mrs. Melanie Redman, who is also the wife of Mr. Stefan Gaetz. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing well your name.
That's good.
Great. So Mrs. Melanie Redman is a co-founder and president and CEO of Away Home Canada. It's a national coalition remaining solution to youth homelessness, through transformation in policy, planning, and practice. Away Home Canada has inspired communities and countries around the world to adopt the Away Home brand as a way to participate in a growing international movement for change. Melanie also leads the national leaning community of youth homelessness in Canada, which is a pan-Canadian community of practice for youth homelessness services providers. Melanie is also the co-founder and partnership and implementation director for the Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab, and which is an international network of centers for excellence. Thank you, Melanie. Look forward to hear you. So Dr. Stefan Gaetz is a professor in the Faculty of Education and the president and director of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and the Homeless Hub. Dr. Gaetz is committed to a research agenda that foregrounds social justice and attempts to make research on homelessness relevant to policy and program development. His research on homelessness has focused on economic strategies, health, education, and legal and justice issues, and more recently, he has focused his attention on policy and particularly the Canadian response to homelessness. Dr. Gaetz is a founder member of Away Home Canada, which is a national coalition to prevent and end youth homelessness, and the scientific director of the Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab. This said, I would like to welcome again my participant. Let me see one last time who's in. Thank you. I'll give you to speak. Thank you, doctors.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for having us. Just a bit of context. In both of our introductions, we talked about the Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab, which is a federally funded network of centers of excellence, the first social science-led one in the country. And we were collectively awarded to co-lead this between Away Home and the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, $17.9 million that we can invest in original research to fill knowledge gaps on youth homelessness prevention and sustained exits. And we have also a series of demonstration projects that are funded through another source within the federal government, the Youth Employment and Skills Strategy, to do demonstration projects in communities across the country on models of prevention and housing first for youth. And it's in that context that we present to you today about Duty to Assist, which is a policy innovation that we're going to discuss its origins, its evolution, and how we're testing it in our Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab sandbox, where we have the luxury to try out some really innovative and sometimes radical things to stop young people from experiencing homelessness, and if they do, to move out quickly with housing and support that will lead to well-being, social inclusion, attachment to education and employment, all of the things that currently aren't happening with our response to youth homelessness.
Great, thank you. So we'll begin the presentation now. We'll start with just talking about what's the problem we're trying to solve with Duty to Assist, a little bit of background.
That looks great.
So responding to homelessness in Canada, and for those of you who are pretty in touch with the social issues the country faces, this won't be a surprise. We invest very little in prevention. People coming from public health must think that's absolutely crazy, but we don't. And most of the bulk of the resources, and it's a lot of money, go to an emergency response once people are in deep, deep crisis, and you see that playing out in communities across the country. We have made some progress on housing and support for people, getting them out of homelessness through Housing First and other initiatives. But where we're at with prevention is probably even smaller than the graphic indicates. Mm-hmm. So in 2016, Steve's shop and my shop collaborated on the first national study on youth homelessness ever in Canada, Without a Home. And then we've since conducted a second study, which the results will be forthcoming in the next 6 months. And then we also did a pan-Canadian consultation with youth with lived experience of youth homelessness to ask them what would it have taken to prevent their experience of homelessness. And we've learned a lot from all of that data. First, we're waiting way too long to intervene.
Yeah, one of the most striking things we learned from talking with young people about their experience of homelessness is that of currently homeless youth in Canada, 40% had their first experience before they were 16. And for that group in Canada, we do almost nothing. And that group has the most adverse childhood experiences, most likely to have been involved in child protection, have multiple episodes of homelessness, already compromised mental health and well-being. And we have a system in many jurisdictions, if they have any homelessness services at all, they start at the age of 18 or 16. And we heard from young people who said, I was 15 and I was told when I was 16 I could go to a shelter. Then they go to the shelter and they're told, you're not a priority until you're chronically homeless and very sick. That's an insane way to respond to youth homelessness.
And that leads to the second point, which is the experience of homelessness has a devastating impact on health, safety, mental health, and well-being.
And we had some pretty startling data from that. We found that 85% of young people who are currently homeless were presenting with mental health issues such that if they were housed, they'd be somewhere between inpatient and outpatient care. Many come to the streets with those pre-existing mental health problems, but it's the experience of life on the streets, the trauma that they experience and violence and exploitation that contributes to these horrible mental health outcomes.
And then in addition, some young people, including Indigenous, LGBTQ2S, newcomer youth, experience additional burden of discrimination and exclusion. Fourth, the emergency response does not prevent or end youth homelessness. We have a lot of wonderful work going on and well-meaning service providers, but unfortunately, it's just keeping young people mostly mired in emergency circumstances. Fifth, our public systems are failing to prevent youth homelessness. One of the most glaring examples would be the child protection system and exiting young people into homelessness without taking the time and the effort to develop clear strategies for young people for what's going to happen when their care supports end.
So to just put it in stark relief, in Canada, 0.3% of Canadian youth have had some experience with child protection. Amongst young people experiencing homelessness, it's 58%. And so that's a huge gap where people transition from homelessness, or transition from child protection. Either they age out and it's happy birthday, here's your clothes in a garbage bag, or they choose to leave earlier. But that's a failed response, right? We're in a sense evicting young people into homelessness.
And finally, people with lived experience of youth homelessness, and the ness is missing, sorry about that, strongly profess the need to shift to prevention. So we're hearing it directly from folks who've experienced homelessness that the way we're responding currently is just inadequate. So do we need prevention? Yes.
And I think in this context, it's important to talk about the role of prevention. So in other countries, they have taken a more preventive approach to youth homelessness. But in Canada, Canada tends to follow the lead of the United States, and in both countries, there hasn't been a strong emphasis on it. In the United States, they did with veterans, but not much else. And we're now at a situation where we're evolving in some really good ways in Canada, so that focus on housing first is important. The argument often is that once we house all the chronically homeless people, we can turn our attention to homelessness or to prevention. But that's not really necessarily true. So we're in a time where we're moving away, or starting to, from that focus just on crisis emergency services with a new paradigm that's actually about 20 years old. So that involves housing first, which is a good thing. Absolutely support, meaning people get access to housing without preconditions, right? And they get the wraparound supports they need. These combined with plans to end homelessness, which are also very important. We need strategies. We can't just be reactive. We need to figure out how are we going to reduce the numbers. And then finally, part of the paradigm is targeting chronically homeless people because of their high needs. And that's an important thing to do, is prioritize them. But none of these, all of these things together, as good as they all are not sufficient to really lead to an end of homelessness. So this is some data from the United States, point in time counts over 11 years through that new paradigm between 2007 and 2017. And you can see that the numbers have declined. They're probably up significantly since that time, however. And there was even a drop in chronic homelessness that was around 26%, I believe. Now that's progress, but here's the thing. If we were to wait until we house all the chronically homeless people, according to this approach, and all things being equal, there being no pandemics or other things, right? We would end chronic homelessness in 2040, right? And so this is not a workable approach. It's an important part of the puzzle, but it is not sufficient to end homelessness. What we need, if we really want to end homelessness, is to focus on prevention.
What's the change that we want to see? And this is critical. The diagram from earlier, the small investment in prevention, huge emergency response, some housing and supports. We need to flip the dial a bit to something that looks more like this, with a real understanding of what prevention looks like in policy and practice, and a real investment in those things, and shrink that emergency response, because people will always be in crisis. You're always going to need that emergency response. And it may look different moving forward. It doesn't always have to look like an emergency shelter. And Finland, for example, has shown us that an emergency response can look different than just shelter. Go ahead. And this is a great quote. If we want to stop people dying on roads, we invest money in seatbelts, not in the emergency department. So in the same way in regards to homelessness, why should we wait to intervene with a young person when they're in crisis, when we can intervene early and keep them at home and in school and engaged? And this is what we're all about with this duty to assist we're going to talk to you about.
So this is an example of social innovation, where we have a complex social problem, and we need, if we come to the decision we need focus on prevention, we have to answer the question, how do we do it? How do we know it works? And so duty to assist fits in here.
So in 2018, Steve's team and my team worked together on something called the Roadmap for the Prevention of Youth Homelessness. And in this, it's a pretty fantastic document because—
Hello?
Yes. Can you hear us?
Yeah, yes, it was cut for a second, but go ahead, thank you.
Okay. We didn't get a notification on our end, so everything is clear for us, I think. So the roadmap does a couple of really important things. First of all, it gives tangible examples from Canada and around the world of prevention in action in policy and practice. But it also does something really important, which is it talks about who's responsible for what on this prevention continuum that we've outlined here in this visual. For too long, we've dumped the whole weight of the problem on service providers, and made them responsible for somehow preventing and ending homelessness and youth homelessness in particular here. And that's just unreasonable. And so this does a good job of pointing at, what public systems, what roles funders can play, what roles service providers play, to clarify that we really do have to take a collective approach to solve this problem.
And so, importantly, in the roadmap, we lay out a definition and the topology. So you can see that on the right-hand side that starts all the way from structural prevention, like how do we address the lack of affordable housing or violence against young people, that kind of thing, to how do the public systems that Melanie's been talking about, how can we reorient them to stop the inflow, early intervention, all the way, the final piece is duty to assist. So in this duty to assist, let's look at this in some detail. This is what we think the future looks like. Like if we were able to implement duty to assist in Canada, it would absolutely revolutionize how we think about homelessness. And we believe that this duty to assist is the biggest, potentially the biggest paradigm shift in how we respond to homelessness since housing first emerged in the 1990s. So the origins of duty to assist come from Welsh legislation, which wasn't called duty to assist. It was legislation in the Housing Act of 2014. And what they had done in Wales, they had a right to housing, an existing right to housing, but they were still only prioritizing certain populations in the same way we do in Canada. So it wasn't a full and actualized rights-based approach. And so they came up with this notion that in Wales, local authorities, so that would be local municipal governments, were responsible if they became aware that somebody was at risk of homelessness or had fallen into homelessness, that they were to offer assistance within 14 days. And if the person accepted, they were required to resolve their homelessness within 56 days, which they call 2 months, and I'm not sure. There might be a math problem there in Wales. So this was a dramatic innovation, right? Can you imagine if we framed our system around, you have to help people not be homeless, not welcome to the shelter, right? So it was quite radical shift in direction.
Perspective.
And so the results were pretty immediate. You could see from this table a reduction, this is in different age groups, right, of people who were needing deeper homelessness services because we headed it off at the past, right? So it was quite successful at turning off the taps into homelessness, which means more resources can go to supporting people who are currently homeless and helping them exit homelessness. Now, there are a lot of lessons from Wales. Not everything went smoothly, so it was unevenly implemented in different local authorities. When they were drafting the legislation, they got a bit cautious, as often is the case, and made it so that some service providers could weasel out of their obligations. But what's happened since is interesting. So having learned from Wales, England introduced similar legislation, but made some key improvements on the legislation and have been implementing that. And then Scotland followed. And as if you know anything about in that context, the Scots will really push it even further. And they're now not talking about duty to assist, but duty
to prevent.
Right, so because assist can lead to many things, but not necessarily prevention. And so there's lots going on in the world there, and it's a policy response to homelessness that puts a responsibility to help people there, but doesn't just say you have to help them. There's obviously lots of community supports around the work that enable the prevention to actually happen.
So with this in mind, and Steve and I should name that one of the things that we think is most important is getting outside of your own context and seeing what people in other parts of the world are doing. because there's so much to be learned, and we don't have to recreate the wheel always, but we can take things and adapt them for the Canadian context. And so that's what we do with our work, and in particular with the Social Innovation Lab and all of the demonstration projects and everything that we're working with right now. So we wanted to imagine what this could look like in Canada, but as applied to youth homelessness. And, you know, duty to assist is a rights-based approach. And for us in our collective work on youth homelessness, that's the lens that we bring to the work as well. And especially in Canada now with a legislated right to housing, it's really important for us to figure out what are the tangible mechanisms by which young people can realize that right. And we believe that duty to assist could be one of those mechanisms.
And so the way the Welsh legislation is framed, and in England and Scotland, there's a statutory responsibility. So government legislates these requirements, and in order to get it to actually work, they have to do a whole number of things, right? They have to make sure that they have in place the preventive services and supports, these kinds of things. If we were to do it in Canada, we might have to take a different route, because Canada doesn't use legislation so much around homelessness. It works more in terms of at the program level, they invest in activities. And we also think that having the local government have the key responsibility for resolving youth homelessness probably isn't the best thing, given that young people are not likely to show up at City Hall and say, I'm experiencing homelessness, help. So you have to think of like, where are the contact points or the touch points in the lives of young people where help could be made available. And so to get there, we need to make sure that, just like in Wales, that we have in place appropriate youth-focused community supports that will help with the assistance. And so this is kind of how we imagined it would work when we were just working on it conceptually. So if you look at the left-hand side, a young person can, knows that there's help there. And that's a key thing, right? Because most young people won't be aware. No young person wakes up and says, I think what my family really needs is family mediation support, right? They're not thinking about that. So we need to help young people become aware that there's help. We also need to help the adults in their life, direct young people to help, because many adults will know something's going on. It might be a teacher or a coach. It might be the parents of the friend that the young person goes over and stays with, that couch surfs. There's adults out there who know things are going wrong but don't know what to do. So we help get young people to a place where they can connect with supports. There needs to be an assessment and a clear conversation driven by the young person as to what the problem is and what help do they want. What would a solution look like? So very important that it's youth-driven, not we have a prescription for you, Johnny, that kind of thing. And then we make sure they get the right kind of supports through a system of care approach. Depending on their needs, it can be kind of a light touch or much more intensive and long-term. And so all of these things, if we have this in place, you can imagine that, and people are aware that that help is there, we could really turn off the tap on youth homelessness.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. Thank
you. We're nowhere near done.
Okay, you can go ahead. We definitely have a lot of questions, but we'll wait and see. Go ahead.
So it comes back again to that thing, in the Welsh legislation, it's the local government, but it's the young people, the adults in young person's life who we need to think about, like, how can they be mobilized to help, right? Who do young people engage with who are adults? And so that's an important thing. And
what institutions need to be at the table. So many of the drivers of youth homelessness also need to be part of creating the solutions. So for what we've done in Hamilton, Ontario, is designed a bit of a pilot project that we're building out even in the context of the pandemic. And so we want to tell you about the first phase of the project. So what was really interesting with Wales is they designed the legislation and rolled it out from the top down. Now, they did spend some time building up the community supports in place, so when they rolled that out, there would be community support for people so that you could actualize that duty to assist. But what we wanted to do is ask the question, what would it look like to build capacity on the ground that if there were a duty to assist, it could be fully realized? And so in Hamilton, Ontario, they have a long history of collective action on youth homelessness, and they're very well organized in terms of decision-making and planning. And we also have a demonstration project there too, one on Model Youth Reconnect that we'll talk about in a second. And the second, Housing First for Indigenous Youth, led by Indigenous partners with Indigenous Research and Evaluation. And so what we wanted to do is come together with some really thoughtful and innovative folks at Bridgeable, which is a human-centered design firm, to help us imagine and work with stakeholders across the Hamilton community from those different systems, young people with lived experience, all sorts of service providers, et cetera, to imagine what this could look like on the ground.
And so the key thing about human-centered design is it flips around how we typically plan services and programs, where we sit in a room and think, this would be really good for our client if we did this. It starts with a lot of research, talking to the people who are going to be the receivers of the support as to what they need, how they would like to receive it, and what their role would be in it. And so you really have to do that work. You talk with people, but you also discuss with them their personal journey. Like if they have experienced homelessness, what was their backstory there, and how did they wind up where they are today?
Mm-hmm.
Uh-oh. No, it's okay. I just...
You got us out of the slide.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
Here, click it back up.
Okay.
I just wanted to check the time. We still have 20 minutes.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, you still have.
So in 2018, was it, or 2019?
2019.
2019. We did this part. It seems so long ago, doesn't it? So we started with all this background research, right? Did arts-based research with young people. We talked with young adults, teachers, child protection workers, a whole range of people to get their sense of what could something look like. We co-created this idea of duty to assist with relevant stakeholders, and then we developed a service prototype that then allowed us to think, this is what we can do with the pilot project. So we did R&D before we actually leapt into the pilot phase. And so you start with that, what I was talking about, human-centered design, pathway mapping. So here is Melanie. And so, or we'll just make up a name. This will be Brian. So Brian winds up being, having problems at home that have been escalating. So who does Brian talk to? The first people that Brian will likely talk to will be friends, may or may not, but will be friends. But then next might be a doctor or nurse, might be a friend's parents or neighbors, teachers or counselors, potentially relatives, grandparents, aunts and uncles, coach or instructor, faith leader. And so if you look at this list, nowhere on the list is a city government official nor homelessness service provider. They're talking to the people in their world. So if we want to identify young people at risk, these are the kinds of people that we need to be part of the solution, rather than wait till things are so desperate that the person has to leave their community and move to a larger center where they then go to a homeless shelter. And they've then disrupted all these very important natural supports.
And even if the young person doesn't talk to any of these people can see when things are going wrong.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Changes in behavior, patterns that raise alarms, that kind of thing. So we started with teachers and counselors. We thought that's an important place to start if we want to design a pilot, right? And the idea being, if we can figure it out within the education system, which has a degree of complexity that creates some challenges. If we can make it work there, then we can probably make it work across the other public institutions. And so the question is, like, why schools? Why not doctors or nurses? And here's the thing. Every young person who experiences homelessness was in school at one time and spent many hours of their day at school. That's also the place where there are very likely adults in their lives who knew something was wrong but didn't know what to do. Because we don't, I'm in an education program at York University, and we don't train teachers to end youth homelessness, right? They're trained to teach. So we do know that there are some really good examples of how to do school-based early intervention, right? These exist in the world. Australia was the big innovator on this. In the 1990s, when their youth homelessness problem started to explode, they said, it doesn't make a lot of sense to make emergency shelters. Why don't we get in there and help young people? So you'd have these community organizations, right? So this wasn't a requirement of the school, but community organizations that would work with schools in partnership to support young people and their families when they were having trouble, right? So the goals were to keep young people in place, keep them engaged in school, help resolve the conflicts, that kind of thing. And so, so the Youth Reconnect workers would show up at the school, not just like drop in, but they would come in and do class assemblies, talk with students, talk with teachers so teachers knew that there was help there, and potentially talk with parents. Key thing, right? Because then you've got teachers, students, parents know that there's help there if something goes wrong. That's a big shift. So importantly, as part of our work, we also had to think about what do Indigenous youth need. And so there are Indigenous youth services and supports in Hamilton that are really important. So NAWASA is an example. It's an award-winning early intervention program that's, engages with young people at school, that kind of thing.
And so they've been amazing strategic advisors on us for this project.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we take our this model that we framed before and then apply what we've just talked about, like take it a bit further, how does this now work with young people and the education system? So again, we support youth by giving them information about help, right? Like that Youth Reconnect. So they go, oh, I've heard about this Youth Reconnect thing. And access to support. I now know where to go. Likewise with the teachers, counselors, and other staff. They too receive the information and understand that there are supports there and can help. And so the young person then can refer them to the place of connection and support. They can contact the Youth Reconnect and they can meet at a coffee shop or after school or something, talk things through in privacy. And again, the young person's in the driver's seat. Or the adult in their life wouldn't like report them necessarily to the Youth Reconnect, but they could say, I think something's wrong. Why don't we go talk to a Youth Reconnect worker? Maybe they can help. And if the young person thinks that would be good, then you bring them along and then the rest follows through, the supports that are so necessary. So it's important that we put in place the different things we need to actually make this work, right? So you need some kind of centralized intake. You need that community-based youth service. We need to make use of technology, right? Rather than require that somebody, phones or sends a fax somewhere, although I guess that's technology, or has to walk over. So put in place all the things that are necessary to really make this tick. And the approach at the end has to be collective impact. This is not an intervention where the whole burden is on the schools. In fact, this will relieve the schools of burden because it's now bringing to bear other services and support. So Youth Reconnect can do some of the work, but it might be that the young person needs some pretty serious help around mental health and addictions issues, either on their own part or a family member. It might mean they do need that family mediation. So the Youth Reconnect staff not only provide help, but they're also help young people get to other supports that they may need, or their families as well. So the client is not just necessarily the young person, but the young person and their family. So taking all this into account, we went further and designed, well, what exactly do we need to really make this happen?
Yeah, and so Bridgeable worked with all of these community stakeholders to develop what this first step would be in schools, and it's called the Plugged In program. So it's youth-centered school awareness with AI-driven support, with drop-in center, and with real-world training on duty to assist. And we'll just go over this and then we'll be finished.
No problem, you still have about 15 minutes. You can go ahead.
Thank you. So a core component is youth-centered school awareness. So you need strengths-based outreach to promote awareness of duty to assist and the Plugged In program, co-created by students, school staff, and community organizations, where youth voice is front and center of the service experience. Using artificial intelligence, you have a recommendation engine for students. So we have an AI-driven advice generator using a friendly text-based interface, help students plug into the community by finding them the local resources they need, with an anonymous chatbot for students to ask sensitive questions. And then a core piece of the service of Plugged In is a common ground drop-in center, which is space at school for staff and students to plug into community supports, with a dedicated team of support workers from community organizations and flexible meeting options for students.
And so, just so you know, in the meantime, we've been working with 2 companies around developing that, the technology side of things. And so, it seems to be something that's very doable. So we'll show you what it would look like from the perspective of a young person, right? So this is Sarah. She's a new student in grade 10 at school. And she's having problems at home, but doesn't know who to talk to, right? She doesn't have a huge group of friends that she trusts necessarily, doesn't know the teachers that well, and she's kind of stuck. But one day when she was at school, they had this assembly, and this Youth Reconnect worker comes in and starts talking about what youth homelessness is, what it's like, and what kind of supports that Youth Reconnect can offer. This helps her make sense of some of the posters that she's seen around school that talk about this new program and where she might be able to get help. So she, on the poster, it says, download this app. So that's what she does. She starts, asking questions and getting some help. And then she's advised to go talk to her teacher. And so she does that. And he says, you know what? There's something we can do here. If you are interested, I will take you down and introduce you to the Youth Reconnect worker. So let's go. And so they walk down to that drop-in center, and he does the handoff, right? So the teacher's not required to solve all her problems, but does the handoff. She goes in and meets with a Youth Reconnect worker. They start the conversation. The Reconnect worker says, what would you like to see happen? What would success look like? And the young person says, I want better relations with my family. Would you like us to go and meet with your family and talk about this? And so it begins. And then through time, Sarah feels like she has the support she needs, and her risk of homelessness declines.
Now, for teachers, counselors, and staff, it looks different because teachers need some real world training. And so that's a huge component of all of this. And also the AI engine that we're talking about would look different for teachers in terms of what are some actionable steps and pathways to connect students to community supports. And also we've heard from teachers that they don't always know how to start the conversation. So there's also a component that with conversation starters, so sort of an if-then mechanism.
And all of this tech is really, it's interesting how it works. So the more people that you get using this kind of system, machine learning happens, which means that the program can anticipate needs and what is lacking in this kind of thing. So it's quite an exciting area of technology. So this is a teacher, Catherine. She's a grade 9 teacher. And she has a particular student where she's noticed a change, right? Like this is a student who is doing quite well, but all of a sudden rarely shows up for class. starts to get in trouble with other students. The school performance drops, sent to the office. And so she's wondering what's going on, right? So she doesn't know how to talk to her students in this situation to say, hey, are you okay? Like what's going on? And also an important thing is in Canada, teachers are often dissuaded from offering help in these kind of situations. And so she doesn't quite know what to do. But she too was at this General Assembly and learned about plugged in. And so she decided to do a little research on her own. She did the plugged in work and saw that there's a way to get students the help they need. And it helped her figure out what her role was and what steps she knew she had to take. So she downloaded the app and it asks her questions. Has he been acting out? Is the student less social? What's going on? And then gives her some advice and recommends that she helps the young person. So she talks to the student, having got some coaching around how to approach the student. And they set up an appointment together, the student wanting the help, but just needing a helpful adult in their life to help them navigate this, and met with the Youth Reconnect worker. And so Catherine now knows how to help students in this situation. And so rather than this become an extra burden on teacher, this helps relieve her in many ways.
And so we'll close with our next steps here. So key, even in the context of the pandemic, our staff teams are moving forward with stakeholder buy-in from all of these important stakeholders. And people are pretty excited about it in Hamilton, especially young people with lived experience or who are currently experiencing homelessness and know that this is what could have helped them. So we have a planned rollout. Like we said, we're starting sector by sector with the education system. Next will be child protection. And again, everything that we learned from each of these experiments with these systems, we can apply to other systems, and so on and so forth. And in the meantime, we'll continue with the education system in schools, relationship building, child protection, all of the other partners around the community that are going to be key in helping us deliver this. And simultaneously, we're also working with key government stakeholders that are watching this closely, because they too can see that it would be a tangible mechanism to realize someone's right to housing, and also a pretty awesome upstream policy intervention that can be modeled for many of our social needs.
So here's some of the things that we're working on right now to get it in place. But I think we'll just move to the next slide and just a few final comments. One of the interesting things about the work we're doing is it's actually caught the attention of people in Wales and England and Scotland, where they're realizing the missing piece in their whole approach to duty to assist is that they aren't engaging the public institutions in the same way we are. And so we may influence them back. The things we need to make sure we get right are that we get the right kinds of support for young people. But going back to what Melanie said earlier in terms of Indigenous youth being overrepresented and LGBTQ2S youth and Black youth, we have to design an approach that makes sure we don't further marginalize those young people. But we feel that if we can pilot this and show success, that's how we can then start moving it into other places in Canada. And enough communities are saying, this is the way we need to go, then I think higher orders of government will start to pay attention. We can't wait for them to lead on this, because they won't come to this, I don't think, as readily as if there is a really good on the ground example that they can respond to.
Oh, wonderful.
Look at that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So it was very insightful. What I take from it is it's a collective effort. It's a complex process. It takes a lot of people to come in and punch in. But now the question, I'm looking at the Q&A question. Allow me to go and check again. I will refresh. I do have one question, but before I go ahead with that question, I'd like to know You've mentioned this is the first time here in Canada, so there is no such initiative, right?
No.
I know that here in Quebec, they do have something similar, rather on working with the sex workers and mental health. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, and I'm just mentioning it because it was the one and only initiative. It's the first time and had great success. On a provincial and national level. Now, if I go ahead with the question that was asked on the Q&A, up until now, if I'm not mistaken, I have only one question, and it's about the fund level. So from a sustainability perspective, where will the funding come from for the youth connector workers in jurisdiction right across Canada? Can you tell us more about that, please? Thank you. And thanks for the person who questioned.
Yeah, what we know from research is that preventive interventions cost less than if we wait till people become homeless and get sick. And so the funding could come from a variety of sources. In Canada, the funding for existing homelessness services come from all orders of government. Federal government is usually a smaller portion, but the provincial governments, municipal governments, social service, different departments of government could do this. So, the funding would be, if there's a compelling case that can be made for this service delivery, for this approach, I should say, the funding for the service delivery will follow, right? Because if it's seen to be an effective solution, then we imagine that funders would want to back this.
And one of the things that we do is we convene a funders table of philanthropic organizations from across Canada, and we keep them very close to the work that we're doing. And one of the initiatives that they've been most interested in is the duty to assist. And so with this funders table, we brought Peter Mackey from Wales, who is one of the architects of the legislation there, to talk with the funders about what they did in Wales. And then we talked about what it can look like in Canada. And we've been doing the same thing in terms of our government relations with different orders of government. We start by letting them know what we're doing, and then we just keep them abreast as it rolls along of what we're learning. We don't ask for anything, we're just keeping people informed. And I think if we continue to do that and continue to show success in moving this forward, I think we'll have a decent amount of buy-in, as Steve said.
And also you have to think that these other public institutions, whether it's education or healthcare or child welfare, if they're interested in this approach, if they recognize not just that there's a problem, but that those institutions can be part of the solution, there should also be funding available there. If we really take a collective impact approach, it requires that deep partnership and commitment beyond just the priorities of a particular organization or institution to achieve change. So if the government is spending money on emergency services and supports, which it must do because we have this crisis, and if the government is interested in reducing the incidence of homelessness and the damage that it causes, then I think the funding will follow.
But the other thing I think it's important to note is the funding for the current Youth Reconnect project we have in Hamilton is funded by the Youth Employment and Skills Strategy. And if you think about the work of Youth Reconnect, one of the impacts is to keep young people engaged with education, which is really critical for their long-term success. And so, I think that is a big selling point is attachment to education. But then also, one of the things, given the context of this conference, we're going to be very mindful of are the gaps in mental health services for young people.
Can I ask a question? I'm sorry. I didn't get a chance to. I really respect very much and have huge admiration for all of the work that you've put into this. I can tell this has taken a lot of time and effort, and yes. However, I would like to ask the question of what consideration, like, have you consulted with lawyers? Because in Canada, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guarantees us the life, liberty, and security of the person. So public institutions, like, we already have an obligation to follow the Charter in Canada. So do we not already have a right to shelter? Because you can't have security of the person without a roof over your head.
Exactly.
So I don't know why we're having to go look in other countries.
Well, the problem is this around rights. There's several layers of problem. Canada's a signatory to many international covenants on human rights, including the rights of the child. But having been a signatory doesn't mean that we actually follow it, right? And so there's one thing about having rights-based language, but there's also the challenge of actually ensuring that people can actualize those rights. Canada has a new, last year legislated the right to housing, but there's a lot of things that are missing from there. It doesn't apply to individuals. It doesn't apply when the right is breached by provinces or territories. It's not justiciable, which means that the young person, or not a young person, anybody, could sue the government or go to court to have their rights respected. So the challenge around rights, legislation, and obligations is that often it's not backed up by a legal requirement of government to actually do something. And so, Scotland or Wales too had a right to housing. And so the way legislation around rights is written, you have to pay very close attention to it, because sometimes it's heavier on language than on action. And so if we had in Canada a tradition of actually living up to people's rights, like the International Covenant on the Rights of the Child is really clear that young people should have the right, or young people do have the right to housing, they do have the right to education, they do have the right to safety. There's a whole range of things they have the right to, but being a signatory does not mean that we actually do anything about it, or that there's a legal remedy that would allow us. We cannot sue the government successfully because it's failing to meet its obligations on these international.
I have to interrupt, I'm sorry, but the Charter is Canada. That's not something that's a signatory thing.
As is the legislation.
We have to follow the Charter in Canada.
as is the legislation on the right to housing is it's a Canadian legislation. It's not an international thing, right? But it's still, the language of it will enable some actualization of rights, but not everything, right? So,
and we are working with, for your first question, Samantha, which was an important one, we are working with a constitutional lawyer from the beginning on designing what could it look like in the Canadian context. So
if these things were working, then we wouldn't need a duty to assist.
Exactly, to begin
your
with.
point is right.
Thank you, Samantha, for your question. I just want to make sure.
I'm done speaking. I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course. You can go ahead with it if you have any other.
I'm just concerned, but I mean, you're basically waiting for individuals to challenge that their charter rights are being breached by Canada. So I don't really think that's a safe approach. Like, I think Canada has to, and each province has to enforce charter rights.
Agreed.
I would totally agree with that,
Yeah.
but we don't really have examples where that's strongly enforced.
As of now. Okay.
Well, we can't wait for that. That we're Canada. We're supposed to be following the law.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. But yeah, we wouldn't need to be doing the work that we're doing if on homelessness at all, and we could work on something else, which I would be happy to do if people's rights were realized. So
I would suggest perhaps maybe a human rights lawyer should maybe consult with your constitutional lawyer.
We work with Justice for Children and Youth as well, and that's their area of work, and we have actually quite a bit of work with lawyers around human rights.
And we're not done. We'll continue. Like we said, Samantha, this is a work in progress, and the purpose of doing a small pilot at the community level is you can really work out what are the kinks.
Yeah, how do you actualize these rights?
And
right?
What are the opportunities to connect with other obligations and professional standards? I think that's one of our big questions is how do we look at existing professional standards? Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Samantha, for your question. I just want to make sure Mr. Bob Raleigh was okay with the answer he got. Did you have anything maybe you want to add from your end? I can unmute you. Are you still here? Mr. Bob? Hello?
She might be muted.
He's already unmuted. Okay, maybe not. Maybe we should follow with the other question. So I have a second one for you. How can health providers engage with you directly to inform decision about housing and homelessness prevention? How do you see that? And that's a question from Miss Diane Quickle. Thank you, Diane.
That is a really good question, right? So many young people will talk to healthcare providers, whether it's a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a nurse. That could be any number of healthcare providers. And I think we would see the same kind of challenge that you would see with talking to a teacher, right? If that provider doesn't know much about the experience of homelessness and has no idea about what kinds of supports would be there, they may not be able to help, right? So that's why we need to ensure that these public institutions have access to an understanding of how to actually provide a person with help on that front. I think many physicians would and nurse practitioners would be very aware of the importance of housing to well-being if they take a determinants of health perspective. But not knowing actually when someone's sitting in front of you saying, I'm couch sleeping at my friend's house, but they say I have to leave at the end of the week and I don't know what to do. You know, without proper training and ongoing support and a place to help direct someone to, those providers are in a tough position. It's not that they're not well-meaning or incompetent, but we haven't designed those systems to be part of a response to homelessness. And so that's where we would like to get to.
In London, Ontario, they have a fantastic pilot that's shown some great success for people that are currently in the hospital system and are facing homelessness when they exit. And they've done a really great job in working with service providers around transition planning, ensuring that no one is discharged from a hospital setting into homelessness. So I think there are a lot of really great promising things out there that people are attempting.
Exactly. We can build on those kind of successes.
So are we talking about such approach on a national level or just a provincial one?
Well, the challenge in Canada constitutionally is that provinces and territories are responsible for certain public institutions.
Exactly.
So healthcare delivery, education system, child protection, to name a few, and then they co-share things like around employment, justice, these kinds of things, depending on the age. So to do things in Canada means we actually need all orders of government to be involved, right? So like police services, depending on where you are in Canada, can be a provincial, federal, or municipal responsibility. So that kind of complexity means that it would be very hard to imagine ever a federal legislation that mandated school systems or child protection to do certain things, because constitutionally they can't do that. So we have to like work at that federal level, but also province and territory by province and territory. That's the only way we'll ever get there. Now, the more that there are promising examples of what to do, the greater the possibility that other jurisdictions will look at it and go, well, we could do that as well. That's why.
Sorry, I have a comment. I took constitutional law as well. From what I remember, like, I don't really know why we need to have the argument, because when there's a conflict between legislation, it's always the federal that should be trumping the provincial. So really, I don't really think the federal government has a choice at this point. They really have to take control of this situation. Like, we don't have time for the two to fight.
Yes, the federal government has a huge leadership role to play, and they could legislate, but they are very loath historically to wade into that space. And we've talked directly with elected officials and public servants, and it would be highly unusual for the government to do that kind of thing. It's not that they can't, but they're loath to do that.
I think it's politics.
Ms. Diane, did you have anything else to add? Are you satisfied with your answer?
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think I just always struggle. We come from a public health background, and I always struggle with how can public health providers engage with community members directly. Not just about referring to services, but how do we do that in a way that actually we can draw on them as a source of knowledge and expertise to inform what we should actually do. So different youth homelessness projects that have youth on the advisory board, for example. So, you have youth and the chief of police sitting side by side at the table, right? And so I'm always looking for those mechanisms providers can do to engage, to help develop these prevention plans. Like, what are, the youth know best.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, I agree with you completely. The more that we engage young people and bring their voices to, foreground, like what would help you, the better our responses will be. And so
on the policy level.
Yep, on policy and practice, right? Because sometimes it's not the policy, it's how the services get delivered that become the problem. So the more that we kind of foreground that and operationally ensure that whatever kind of systems of help we design for young people, that they're driving the bus and their voices are heard.
And Diane, on that public health question, we spend a lot of time thinking and talking about this because we really feel, and most of the folks we work alongside feel, that the homelessness should be situated as a public health issue. So and it's not,
but it should be.
But it should be. And so, for example, in most provinces and territories, if there is a ministry responsible for homelessness, because not all have that, it's usually situated within a housing ministry. And it would be probably helpful if it were situated in the Ministry of Health. And so we do think that would be helpful if we could at least get the issue itself situated there.
Yeah. 2 thumbs up for me. I get you.
Thank you, Diane. Well,
thank you.
I mentioned the policy level to go back to the question of Mr. Bob earlier. You feel free to come in if you need to add anything else. But I think it's important to have funds to be able to react and act on a local, provincial, and also on an individual level. For you've mentioned how important it is to empower our youth, but how can we empower them on the education level per se if we have no money, if it's not a priority?
Yeah, that's a challenge with policy making, and we've seen it in time and again, including recently with some um, reforms in Ontario around child protection, where the policy will signal a shift to do something differently without any funds attached. Or when the government of Canada renewed the homelessness strategy in 2013 and said you have to devote 70% of your funds to housing first, which wasn't a bad idea, but actually reduced the amount of the budget for the homelessness program. So policy often breaks down where it's, you know, an expectation of change, but no ability to actually implement it.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? You can raise your hand if you want to, or just mute yourself. We still have about 15 minutes to go ahead, and we're doing a great job. Thank you very much.
I have
Yes,
just
go ahead, Samantha.
The discussion of child protection. And I think I heard you earlier say that you were looking at rolling your ideas and the duty assists that you're working on out to the education system first, then child protection. So I'm not really clear why, like in the child protection system, why would we have to even be looking at having to have a duty assist? The child protection system already has that duty. That's their whole job. They're supposed to be assisting every single person. They're supposed to be protecting the whole family. So I'm not understanding. Maybe you can clarify, like in the child protection system, what you're looking at.
That's a really good question. So the child protection system, you're right, currently has duty to assist, but there are limitations on what that involves, right? And so depending on what jurisdiction you're in, right? Like there are different levels of involvement. Like some of it can be just the child protection people are there monitoring what's going on, or the child protection people can be supporting the family and the young person, or that they can make an arrangement where the young person is either voluntarily by the family or non-voluntarily, you know, moved to another living arrangement, to them becoming wards of the state. So there are many different touch points for child protection. Their ability to, or you know, to remove somebody, which isn't always a good idea anyway, but to do that is bound by legislation around what exactly it is, and it's usually around, you know, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, where there's an ongoing risk to the young person if they stay in that place. So there's a notion of safety and what are the safety issues that are there. If there's a case where the young person's having difficulties with the family and there's no necessarily any evidence of abuse, but there's conflict, the child protection worker would be greatly assisted if there was experts who do work with young people who are, you know, teenagers, who could support, because child protection workers in the jurisdictions I'm familiar with have very heavy caseloads and can't necessarily say, okay, we're going to meet, you know, twice a week to do, you know, family counseling and you know, motivational interviewing and a whole range of things. And so when we talk with child protection workers, especially also knowing what we know about the fact that young people are going to age out of care at some point, child protection workers actually see this as a valuable add-on, which, you know, they're not seeing it as like you're duplicating the services. It's more, they see it as a complementary piece of work that would really help them do the work because in their own triaging as child protection workers, they're going to have to put their energy where there is, in terms of their mandate, the greatest risk and the greatest need for support. And so that may mean that even though they identify that this young person and their family need a particular kind of support, they may not have the personal resources or within their child protection organization the resources to give the family the help they need on that kind of issue.
Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I think they're the one who are the closest to community level. So they're the one who knows what the problems are to be able to bring them up.
They may be, but they may not as well, right? So it depends on how much contact they've had with the family or that kind of thing. They're one of many touch points, right? Like that's part of the point, is that it may be that the young person's coach or, you know, music instructor, they have a better rapport with the young person. I think families generally, in engaging with child protection, you know, I have to be careful how I say generally, but often because of the potential threat of removal of the child, that complicates the relationship between the family and the child protection worker.
As well as the stigma of being involved in child protection.
So if you can have other kinds of support that come in a different way, with more specialization around the needs of adolescents and young adults, then I think that that's a useful complement to the important work that's already being done.
Can I ask a question?
Thank you. I just have Miss Claire Bettler. She's been waiting for a while. If you want to go ahead and ask your question, I have muted you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Melanie and Steve, for that really incredible presentation. And thank you for all of the hard work that you're doing, that I know you'll continue to do. I'm a registered nurse, and I was a public health nurse. And, you know, public health nurses also are part of your equation there, so that you had on the map. But I'm interested, given that we're talking about policy, to hear some of your comments on the Social Innovation Lab. So sort of stepping out of your project, because you do hear governments, and even in some surprises, wanting to look at social innovation and social innovation processes to address some of those really wicked or sticky problems within, perhaps expensive problems or issues within their jurisdictions. And then if you have time, I have a second part to the question. I'm fascinated by your notion of the observatory. So if you even could talk about that structural piece from you know, how you see the observatory playing a role in advancing our efforts, if you will, our collective efforts to address or prevent homelessness. So if you could start with the social innovation and then move to your observatory.
I'll just make a comment first. I know Steve has a ton to say about this. This is one of his favorite subjects. But
Allow me, please, before you go ahead with your answer, we still have about 8 minutes. So if we could give you about 5 to 6 minutes, and then we go ahead and close the session, please. Thank you.
Definitely. So one of the things, you know, governments can talk the talk about social innovation and about, you know, using it to address wicked problems, but they don't do very well. What they don't do very well is enabling that. And, you know, even with the social finance strategy and all of the consultation, et cetera, the mechanisms that we have that are federally funded to do this work of social innovation are structurally the antithesis to fostering innovation. So it becomes, actually, we have to be incredibly creative for working around the bureaucracy that actually stops us from doing some of the things that we're attempting to do.
Yeah, and so in doing a social innovation lab and using the word social innovation, we're also mindful that of jargon. And it, like, if you, and I've spent a lot of time looking at this, most of the things that are called social innovation labs don't really involve a lot of social innovation and certainly aren't labs. So the language of the lab is that we test things out, right? And try to solve wicked problems, of course, but like figure out different ways of doing it. And so we've built our organizational structure in a very, I think, careful way to understand how do we generate knowledge that's of use, responding to very particular needs, but also how do we then take that knowledge and get it out there so that it gets taken up by other people and implemented. So those are like very kind of different but very interconnected questions and processes. And so I'll just talk briefly about the Observatory because it's one of the co-leads along with Way Home. But like the Observatory came about, I had worked in the homelessness sector for a number of years and in government, and so there was a real anti-intellectualism in the world of homelessness. People didn't want research or didn't see it as valuable. So we set out to develop an approach to research where we would always work in partnership, right? Never just sit as researchers in a room, always work in partnership to define the research agenda, to conduct the research and mobilize it so that it could potentially have an impact on solutions to homelessness. And so the Social Innovation Lab takes it much further and deeper in that we actually, again, working in partnership and working with young people and working with people with lived experience of homelessness, we take the researchers and what they do and work with service providers and others and people in government to shape the ideas and then test them out. And then we need to be able to help people, right? So the first question we had around funding was really important, right? So like there are lots of things that get in the way of applying innovation, right? So we can like identify a really important problem. We can do some great research. We can come up with really good ideas about what to do to address that problem, but it can end there, right? So we have to be able to win hearts and minds. We have to, in different places, whether it's funders, governments, different orders of government, whether it's service providers, the whole range of people. So we have to have a strategy that kind of takes what we're learning and makes it not only real to other people, but a possibility that they could do something. And that's how we're going to get to the uptake. And that last part, that means doing things like providing training and technical assistance, right? So someone says, oh, I get it. I like this. I want to do it. Now what, right? Like, can we then help support people and other organizations too? It doesn't have to all be driven by us by any means, but support people to then go, okay, let's figure out what will it take to do this? What will it take to actually put this in place? What will it take to help you really drive down the incidence of youth homelessness in your community and have much better outcomes for young people? So there's a whole process there on the innovation pipeline that we spend a lot of time thinking about, and we don't have all the answers, that's for sure. And we're learning a lot of things on the fly and having to adapt as we go. But that's kind of how we think about innovation.
And the permission to fail is really key.
That's right.
And there isn't a lot of permission to fail out there, so we kind of have to build that in.
and our advice is, if you're going to fail quick.
Yeah.
So that you can move on to the next solution.
So on a positive note, because we still have about 3 minutes, one, I would like to know if there is any other quick question before I go ahead and close the session. Anyone? It's all clear. Okay,
just want to say for the great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Samantha. Thank you, Samantha. So one last question. We have about 2 minutes. I would just want to close on a positive note and would like to know your views on that, Dr. Stefan Gaetz and Miss Melanie Redman. And we thank you, of course, for your presence and insight today.
You'd like to know just our...
What's the future for that? How do you see it on a positive note?
We're very hopeful, and we've seen in the last 5 years a real shift in Canada, where 5 years ago people didn't want to talk about the prevention of homelessness, and now communities are saying, wow, we have to figure this out. So, you know, so we're seeing that more and more, and so that's exciting because that's fertile ground.
So that's a positive note. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I don't think they mind that, but that's fine. Hi, did you have a good walk? I'm coming in soon, Google. Okay.
Not sure who's talking. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That will close our session, and we look forward to see you all tomorrow again, tomorrow in the morning with the first session.
Thank you.
All best regards to all.
Bye.
Goodbye.